Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, I know we have new listeners and regular listeners to this daily show, but for those of you that don't know, before I was the tech writer guy and the tech podcaster guy, I earned my stripes in nearly 20 years in IT, where I went through the ranks. But I did spend an enjoyable period of time looking after an application estate of over 200 applications and all the pain that comes with that. But there is a side of me that will always be the IT apps guy too, and anything that can improve that world will always capture my attention. So when I heard that a company called Eventador was created to help companies deal with the massive fire hose of streaming data, I wanted to learn more about how they operate and also why they're so passionate about building these solutions that are turning out to be real game changers for their customers. And the Eventador Platform too removes the need for additional database, web server, load balancing, and all other complex infrastructure, which ultimately means developing streaming applications is now faster and less costly than with current, often piecemeal stream processing systems. And the result is it can increase innovation and access to new revenue streams with faster application time to market. So if you're a techie wanting to find out more, business leader wanting to know what it could mean for your business applications, or a startup founder wanting to learn more about the story behind this startup, I've got you covered on all three bases. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Austin, Texas, so we can speak with Kenny Gorman, founder and CEO of Eventador. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Kenny. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
My name is Kenny Gorman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Eventador.io. And we are a 8-person company in the States who is insanely focused on streaming data and bringing SQL and SQL interfaces to streaming data.
Cool. And for anyone out there hearing about you for the first time, Eventador is described as the streaming data engine for killer applications. But can you just set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about the kind of problems that you set out to solve and exactly what it is?
Sure. So, if you're not familiar, streaming data isn't always, streaming video or streaming audio. It's actually streaming data about various things. So, for instance, IoT devices are obviously a great source of streaming data, but also things like clickstream data, financial transactions, network security, packets and things like that are all streaming data. And the modern enterprise is starting to double down and use streaming data more and more. Because it builds, ultimately you can build more compelling or more competitive applications with that kind of data. The here and now, the relevancy, and the timeliness of streaming data makes these applications more interesting and more competitive. And so that's really where we fit in, is we're helping customers bring from ingest to application the idea that it can be easy to stream data, use it in your applications, and build those killer applications and make your company more successful.
And Eventador also recently announced that it was shattering the barrier between streaming data and applications. But can you just provide an overview of that announcement and exactly what it means for organizations?
Right. So if and we can dive into this deeper, but if you've been using a traditional, message queue, or you've been using a distributed log like maybe Apache Kafka for storing your streaming data, which is very popular these days. Apache Kafka is on a massive tear. Adoption is way up. Companies are starting to realize that that's a great way to capture and store and distribute your data throughout your organization. Except there's one problem, and that is, how do you then take that data and use it in your applications? And engineers and developers for a long time have been writing applications that consume data from databases, and they're used to connecting to a database, used to running a SQL query, getting some data back, and using that in an application somewhere. Maybe it's a a dashboard application, or maybe it's, an iOS app on your phone, or whatever that might be. Traditional databases have been a big part of that infrastructure for a very long time. And as of late, with the rise of things like microservices, cloud native applications, things like Kubernetes, people are building smaller applications that do more discrete tasks. They're loosely coupled, but data powered. And so, those applications have to connect to something and get their data from somewhere. And that API is very tricky today to navigate. And Eventador plugs right in, provides a very nice and seamless API between the stream and more traditional systems. So engineers and application designers and developers can address streams of data like they would typically have addressed in queried databases.
And we will have a mixture of techies, business leaders, and decision makers listening to this podcast. So just to get everybody on board, what is it that traditionally makes it difficult for businesses to process, handle, and analyze streaming data?
Really, it's a paradigm shift. There's been a number of sea changes in the data and in data processing, ecosystem, over the last, decade or two even. And we've, obviously from Eventador's standpoint, we still believe that, traditional databases have a place and are very important in the modern enterprise. But in the last couple of years, we've seen the rise of streaming data that I touched on a second ago. And, for the reasons I talked about, that, it allows you to build these more compelling applications with timeliness to data, and sort of the value of data is higher when the data was just generated. So if that's kind of, the way you frame your thinking, large organizations, traditional organizations, or even brand new companies are starting to adopt streaming data because of these use cases. And whether you're, in the, agriculture space or aerospace or mobility and transportation or even insurance, you want to compete in your various marketplaces. You need to build applications that delight your customers. And whether that's something like in an airline sense, like you're showing, better timeliness on flight arrivals and departures, or whether you're combating fraud in a financial application, the capabilities that streaming data brings to the table are, sea change and much, much higher than you can either do at all with traditional databases or do with a significant cost reduction.
And I'm conscious you might not be able to mention any business names or any of your clients' names, but do you have any use cases that you can share that would just enable people listening to understand how that kind of technology could provide real value to their business too?
The one we talk about a lot is, because I think it makes sense and resonates with a lot of folks, is this sort of idea of a financial transaction and detecting fraud. And so, I'll just try and paint a picture of kind of what that could kind of look like. So, imagine you are taking at a point of sale. Maybe it's like gas station transactions when you're filling up at the pump, or maybe it's a convenience store at the actual point of sale device. In either event, you're streaming back authorizations for credit card. And what you want to do is you have a thesis that says, hey, if someone is authorizing, in this certain pattern, I want to call that fraud and I want to do a couple things about it. So in traditional sense, you might use a pub sub bus. You might actually put that stuff in a database and have a batch routine. None of those things actually work very well if that data comes back an hour later or a day later and says, yeah, that was fraud. At that point, it's kind of too late. And so, and you've seen this as of late, right? I mean, some banks, financial institutions will actually text you right away, right? You'll get an alert on your phone that says, hey, did you just actually authorize this? And you can say yes or no. And if you say, that was me, then bam, it's essentially a form of financial two-factor authentication. And, bam, you're off to the races. You can, your card goes through and you can fill your car. So how do you do that? How does that actually work under the covers? Well, data is streamed to a streaming system. In my case, I'll just call it Kafka. And then you have a stream processor on reading those Kafka messages. And maybe those messages have a card ID, a user ID, and maybe like a location ID, right? And so you're processing them and you're saying, hey, I'm just making up my little fraud transaction here. Maybe in the last few minutes, I've seen it go from, an authorization of $5 and then, oh, that worked. So that might've been fraudulent, but now it's $50 and now it's like, whatever, $500. And so that pattern is actually what you consider fraud for your business. And so it's not somebody, theoretically testing that they can, get larger and larger amounts out of your bank account if they're defrauding it. So in the case of, something like Eventador and using something like Kafka, you can build fraud processing jobs that look for these patterns and then take the data, the output of that processor, and send it maybe to an alerting framework. So that goes out to your customers and alerts them, hey, did you just make this authorization or not? And if you didn't, then it turns off their ability to let that go through. Maybe it stops the card from working or whatever the particular banking rule is. But also maybe it goes into their data warehouse for processing later in an aggregate form. Or maybe it actually gets reprocessed down and then shown on a dashboard, like an internal dashboard for where fraud is happening from a geo location standpoint. Like maybe we have a heat map that we're generating that says, hey, within this, the London metro area, we're starting to see fraud in these particular areas. And so we might give a higher likelihood to actually turn off those transactions if they start to match the pattern. Or further, maybe I'm then training models and building machine learning models on this data for finding patterns for sort of a longer term scope. So, you can build all sorts of interesting financial products. You can, have the ability to, in a very timely manner to affect that fraud flow. I gave the example of, texting to customer right away. And all these kinds of products are really kind of enabled and unlocked when you're starting to think about, these streaming systems.
And on this Daily Tech podcast, I always try and help people listening build a picture of how a guest technology would fit into their organization. And you've set the scene perfectly there. And just to expand on that a little, how are you seeing companies use SQL to unlock Kafka streaming data? And who is it within the organization that would be using it?
It's a really good question because there's kind of two parts to that. Yeah. So I'll try and address both here. I think the first part of that is, how do companies kind of adopt and grow into streaming systems? Do you just rip out all your databases and start over, or to be blunt about it, or is there a way that you can kind of weave streaming systems into your overall data architecture plan kind of going forward? And the latter is obviously the one that is more preferable to most folks, and it's absolutely true. We see many times, a common pattern is to take a distributed log like Kafka or something else, put it in front of your ingestion pipeline where you're actually receiving your traditional data into your databases, use Kafka to take that data and fork it and put it into, your traditional system, as well as then enable these new systems. So that's kind of one way that you can, instead of lift and shift, you can kind of, move into and easily move into a production model using these kinds of systems. And SQL plugs in there nicely. I think, SQL is a whole topic and a whole interesting subset of kind of thinking in and of itself. And the reason is, I talked about these processors that, are looking message by message on a stream of data and doing some sort of computation. Maybe they're aggregating data, or maybe they're filtering it to take out things that just don't matter, noise, that kind of thing. And this, traditionally been written in Java or Scala or some other JVM language. That's the most popular programming language to write these computations in. SQL is interesting because it plugs in, SQL, structured query language, is a declarative language. It's meant to, it's been traditionally used against, databases. So many people know it. It's declarative in nature, so you just ask for kind of what you want to see. So show me the data where dates between blah and, value greater than X. And so it's very easy for, beginners to pick up. And it has a lot of power for even advanced users. And in our mind, it's sort of like an 80-20 equation. 80% of most business use cases can be solved with SQL itself. And I think that's a very powerful statement. And what that does, the net effect of that, and the reason we've doubled down on SQL from our side, is we started to see customers really say, hey, I want a larger audience to be able to create these processors and build these systems. Streaming systems are of the most important and compelling data systems in many of these companies. And those teams are stretched very thin. And writing stream processors in Java or Scala requires pretty unique expertise. It also requires a mind shift, compared to something like a relational database. And so these organizations tend to not have, 100 people working on this project. Maybe it's one or two, and they're very much overburdened. And so when you look at the organization kind of from top down, you say, how can I emit more of these really cool use cases? Using the SQL to unlock that value to a greater developer audience is really a key component.
And although this is a tech podcast, I'm always fascinated by the story behind the company. So I've got to ask, what is the story behind Eventador? I mean, can you share how it all got started? Because I've got a feeling there's going to be a story there.
Sure. So, my personal background is I'm an old crusty DBA. I'm a data nerd from the 90s, sadly, or maybe fortunately, I don't know. Yeah. Myself and my co-founder got started, or at least met when we were at PayPal and eBay. So when I was early on at PayPal, he was early on at eBay, and when those two companies came together, him and I got to work on a lot of projects, and we got to work on some of the toughest scalability and performance problems that PayPal and eBay could throw at us. And it was really fun, and we learned a ton. And back then, this was in the early 2000s. We were doing, we were sharding databases before that was cool. We didn't even have that name for it. We called it something else. We were doing message systems and PubSub before it was cool, and we called it something else then. So, we saw a lot of scale problems. We saw a lot of anti-patterns. We, cut our operational chops in one of the biggest environments of the day, and also became good friends and colleagues during that period. And since then, Eric and I and one other gentleman started a company that was based on MongoDB. If you're familiar, it's a popular NoSQL database, a document database. We built a cloud service around that called Object Rocket. And in 2012, we sold that to Rackspace, and they continue to grow and build that business today. So we're kind of repeat offenders from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Being an entrepreneur is intoxicating and also terrifying. And that's probably a whole podcast that would be interesting in and of itself is, what's it like to build a company from, opening a text editor and starting to type to, we now provide SQL on streams of data. But, we kind of came to the streaming ecosystem by following customers and following use cases. We were, at Rackspace, we had at that time we were running some of the biggest workloads around. One of our customers was Tinder, and there, I forget if you swipe left or right or whatever, but the use cases that they were talking about were super interesting, and frankly, it just couldn't be done on a database like a traditional indexed database with billions and billions of documents, which in Mongo speak is basically like a database row. Just couldn't be done in traditional means. And we started thinking, what are we going to build for these guys that's going to fix this use case? And there was no, we kept tapping into kind of our history and like database architecture and design. Do we need new indexing patterns? Is something like Elasticsearch better? And ultimately we came to the realization that no traditional data store where data is stored and then queried and retrieved would ever do what they needed. And because these use cases were kind of, like I said earlier, super compelling and that companies were going to want to build these real-time products, we thought, well, there's got to be something that does this. And ultimately, the distributed log, which is, the technical architectural name for what something like Apache Kafka is, was that for us. And, a distributed log is kind of like the recovery log of a database. So we understood it from an architectural standpoint right away. And we said, this is how this is going to work. It's an append-only structure. It's highly scalable. It's a distributed system. And it's going to be very effective to use, but people are going to have to be able to query it and build applications against it. And that's what got us excited. So we started Eventador with this idea that streaming data first, and ultimately decided that, running the SQL, and in our case, we used the Apache Flink runtime, was kind of the killer way to do that. And that's when we started to build the product and ultimately brought that to market.
What a great story. And I love how you almost earned your stripes out there in dealing with those toughest scalability and performance issues that eBay and PayPal threw at you, almost prepared you for everything that you're doing now. But for everyone listening, is there any advice that you would offer to any entrepreneurs or startup founders that are inspired by your story and wanting to learn through some of your experiences? What would be the big takeaways for you?
Yeah, it depends on what day you catch me on. Some days are good, some days are bad, I suppose. Being an entrepreneur, and especially right now, is not easy. And I know a lot of people say, I'll just start my company and it'll be my company and I'll do it my way. But there's so much more to it than that. And I think, we founded Object Rocket on a kind of a core principle that like MongoDB wasn't fast enough. And we believed that we could bring an enterprise grade MongoDB cloud, capability to that ecosystem. We founded Eventador on this idea that, modern applications will be powered by streams of data, and that, developers, data scientists, and engineers need to have access to those streams, and they need tooling to do that. You got to have kind of this high level philosophy of what you're trying to achieve, not the solution. Don't put the horse or the cart before the horse, because you have to think about that kind of the customer pain point. You have to think about the actual use case of the product, because you're going to be stretched in 1,000 different ways. I heard somewhere that there's this thing called, there's obviously product market fit. I think many people have heard that phrase, but there's also founder market fit. And to me, that's more important. What that means is you're going to wake up every day and give it hell, even when it's the most gloomy. That means you love your craft. You love what you're building. You love, even through the hard times, you love it so much that you're going to wake up inspired. You're going to be able to inspire others, and you're going to be able to carry that torch forward. And for me, that's the most important thing. If you don't have that, skip it. Don't do it because you want to get rich, because the chances are you're not. Don't do it because you want to be your own boss. Honestly, you're going to have investors, you're going to have employees. You're not going to be your own boss. So the real important thing is to find out that craft you love, and then find that fit in a marketplace with a customer. If you get those two things, just don't give up and you'll be successful.
Fantastic advice. And we are all in a period of uncertainty at the moment, which makes that message even more important, especially as we all endlessly scroll down those depressing news feeds. But
right.
I've got to ask, I don't know if it's too early to ask this question, but is there anything that excites you about the future, or at least makes you feel hopeful about the future?
So I think I hope, in a general sense, I'm an optimist, so I'm always excited about the future. And by the way, you don't become an entrepreneur if you're not an optimist. That you have to be an optimist. You have to believe that, the crazy things that you're saying are going to actually become true at some point. From our standpoint, like in our realm, in our ecosystem, the thing that I think's the coolest thing ever is this notion of mixing SQL with streams. Obviously, I told you about our background and my background and why databases are interesting, and obviously, structured query language just rolls off my fingers. It's the language I know best. And then when we started to bring that to streams, I got excited about that. I thought this could be a really neat way for customers to be able to, introspect and query streams of data. I think, we weren't the first, to be fair. We weren't the first to kind of think about that in those ways. But I think, now if you look at the Flink communities, the Kafka communities, the Pravaga, the other, streaming systems, SQL is becoming a first-class citizen. And just being a little part of that, being a humble and small company that's trying to build kick-ass products in that space is super cool. And I'm loving that we're seeing the understanding of how SQL can be useful in that context, and how streaming data can be, exposed to a wider audience, and the power of SQL is getting better. The underlying engines and capabilities are becoming more powerful. I think things like, even tricky constructs to understand, like materialize views on streams, are becoming things that folks are spending time thinking about, understanding what they do and why. And I think that just empowers folks like us to continue to build. So I'm excited to see that community grow. I'm excited to see folks understanding that, SQL is powerful in that way. And, who knows where we go from here. We have a long roadmap of really cool innovations. We're a small but passionate company building in that space. So, it is that founder market fit. I wake up every day really excited to go build stuff in that space.
And for anyone listening that would like to continue the conversation we start today, or just find out a little bit more information about Eventador, can you just point them in the best direction of the best way of doing that?
Sure. You can always go to our website, www.eventador.io, or you can email us at hello@eventador.io.
Excellent. Well, there's so much I love about what you're doing, especially as a former apps guy. I love how you're increasing innovation to and access revenue streams with faster application time to market. That on its own is an amazing thing. But I love the story behind the company, and your passion for everything that you do really comes through as well. So a big thank you, Kenny, for coming
Thanks,
and
Neil.
sharing that story with me today. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great time. Thanks, Neil.
Now, after recording there, I did make Kenny a promise that if either of our governments ever let us fly again, I'm going to be joining Kenny for a cold beer in Texas, because it's one of the US states that I've not been to and incredibly keen to visit. And just talking about that, I think it's travel that I think I miss most about this lockdown period. My wanderlust has certainly taken a hit. But thankfully, tech has enabled me to talk with Kenny today, and I love hearing about how Eventador is shattering the barrier between streaming data and applications. And the Eventador platform is unlocking streaming application development by actually enabling users to use ANSI SQL to create materialize views on Apache Kafka streams and easily consuming data in RESTful applications. So if you're listening to me in Texas or anywhere in the world and you want to talk to me about today's episode, or indeed anything at all, remember, you can message me anytime. techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all the usual places. Just look for @NeilC.Hughes. And finally, my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find 1,200 other interviews and also how you can work with me. But I suspect a daily tech podcast is more than enough for you, and that's quite all right. So I'll make my apologies and sneak out the back door now, but I'll return tomorrow. So a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.